Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Geezerology's Wednesday Spotlight. Today, my colleagues Bob and Dan and I are going to talk about music from Big Pink, which is the debut album by the band. This album was released by Capitol Records on July 1st, 1968, and it was followed in August by the release of the only single from the album, The Wait, which landed in August of 1968. At the time when these came out, neither the album nor the single made much of a dent on the charts back in the day. The Wait only found its way to number 63 on the Billboard Hot 100, and the album just kind of floated around the bottom half of the Billboard 200 album charts. But the music press of the day, critics back then, they knew the background of this band, particularly as a backup band for Dylan, and the critics really liked music from Big Pink. And so between the critics and the music press and the musicians who always championed it, music from Big Pink kind of stuck around in the consciousness for a while, even though it didn't make that big of a splash on the charts. But the knowledge of it stuck around for a while, and today it's generally regarded as a landmark album. I'm going to tell you right up front that I have always been aware of this album and its status and its place in our culture, but I had never listened to it before about a week ago. And as far as I know, my two colleagues, Bob and Dan, are more familiar and knowledgeable about it. So I'm going to turn it over to you two guys to lead this discussion, and then I'll weigh in a little bit later with my less considered thoughts and opinions. So anyway, Bob, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Scotty. To get into this album, I think you need to know a little bit about the history of the band. The band consisted of 5 people: Richard Manuel on piano, Garth Hudson, primary organ, Levon Helm, drums, Rick Danko, bass, and Robbie Robertson, guitar. Now, of those 5, 4 of them are Canadian. And there's kind of an irony there that they're credited with sort of starting the Americana genre, even though 4 of them are Canadian. And Levon Helm is from Turkey Scratch, Arkansas. Anyway, they were, before the band, they were known as Levon and the Hawks. And they got picked to be Bob Dylan's backing band and for his 65, 66 tours. So they started gaining some not notoriety, but respect, for being Dylan's backing band. And on that tour, it was always posted as Bob Dylan and the band. And when they finally got their own recording contract, they decided to use the name The Band. So anyway, Bob Dylan has a motorcycle wreck, and he goes into seclusion in Woodstock, New York, back in '67. The band joins him there. They live in a rented house that was pink, and they called it Big Pink. And they work on the basement tapes, and they do a bunch of recording and such there. And the basement tapes later got released as an official album. Well, meanwhile, some members of the band started writing their own original material. And that led to the recording contract and the album Music from Big Pink. This was a real departure from what you normally heard in this era of music. It was not guitar driven. It was dominated really more by the organ of Garth Hudson and the piano of Richard Manuel. You didn't have a lot of great guitar licks and things like that. Robbie Robertson's guitar was more of a filler, whatever. And this album is a mixture of blues, gospel, country, folk. So a real departure for the music of this era. Now, as far as I am concerned, this album took quite a while to grow on me. And for me anyway, when I first listened to it, I thought it was kind of chaotic, a jumble of a lot of different things in there and kind of muddled. It felt sloppy. But after listening to it for several times, I really started appreciating its beauty and its uniqueness. the band never had a principal singer. You had three primary vocalists: Richard Manuel, who had this beautiful high-pitched falsetto voice, Rick Danko, who had a tenor voice, and then Levon Helm with that scratchy country drawl type stuff. And then Robbie Robertson did some did vocals also. And so you had these, and they would all take turns, being the lead vocalist. So you had some uniqueness there in the sound. And then when these people brought these really disparate voices together, trying to do a melody or harmony rather, it at first it sounds kind of almost grating. So if you've never listened to this album, don't just dismiss it after your first time. Give it some listens through, and I think you'll start to appreciate it. They covered, Dylan wrote or co-wrote 3 of the songs on this album. The first song that kicks off the album is Tears of Rage, which is kind of an unusual song to kick off an album. It's kind of downbeat, and it's not a real uplifting type song. And then the band covered his song, I Shall Be Released. And their version of that Dylan song is now the definitive standard for this song, just like Hendrix with All Along the Watchtower. The album includes the song The Weight. Scott mentioned that. Initially, it was not a great hit for them. Now it has become one of the recognized standard, one of the great songs of the rock era. And it was included on the soundtrack for the movie Easy Rider, which really helped a lot with this group get some attention on this album. And the best part of the album for me is Levon Helm. To me, I love Helm's singing, and that's my favorite part of the album. There is a cover of the old country classic Long Black Veil, which was done in 1959 by Lefty Frizzell. They covered Dylan's This Wheel's on Fire. You've got a couple classic band songs on here, Caledonia Mission, and like I said earlier, The Weight, which is a very, very well recognized song. I am a fan of the band. I actually like their second album somewhat better than this one, but like I say, this one took a while to grow on me, and now I really appreciate it a whole lot more than I did when I first heard it.
When did you first listen to it, Bob?
Oh, let's see. My first actual introduction to the band was their second album, The Band, which I picked up early 70s. And then the second album that I got was Stage Fright. So I didn't actually circle back to music at Big Pink until probably sometime late 70s. So, but it had already been out for a while before I actually sat down and listened to the entire album. I was already pretty familiar with a lot of the band's music, but it came more from their second album and Stage Fright. So I was a late comer to this album, and did not hear it, when it was first released. So I can't put it into the context of the times. I can just tell you how much, that I did gain an appreciation for it later.
Even us 3 old geezers were young kids at the time. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, yeah. I was 13, I think, when this came out. Right, so yeah. my head wasn't into that kind of space at the time. Yeah, and their second album, which I think what we're going to get into sometime later, is quite a different album. It's much more straightforward, much more, I don't want to use the word cohesive. This is actually a cohesive album if you can get past all the different vocalists and things like that. But the second album, with Up on Cripple Creek and The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down, was a much more straightforward roots type album. This one has got a mixture of a lot of different elements. And when you first hear it, I think it's going to sound to you like a jumbled mess. So like I said earlier, give it some time, go through it a few times, and I think you'll start to appreciate it. At least that's how it worked for me. So
D, when did you first get onto this?
Well, as far as listening to the entire album from front to back, it was actually this past week. I've listened to it in parts over the past, decades, but I first listened to it. I was at a friend's house. It was the summer of '70. It was almost a year and a half after their debut album was released. And the first song I heard from them was The Wait. Well, that album came out, or I think a mutual friend of ours, but we listened to it in his room, and I kind of liked it, that song. The rest of it kind of got me. I thought, where are we going with this? And then of course the movie, as Bob mentioned earlier, Easy Rider, that was a big platform. I think that helped expose them to a much wider audience. And you have to say, this album, I think it defies categorization, because it stood in such contrast to what was big in 1968. I think I was almost 15 when they released this, so I was still influenced by AM radio and a little bit of FM. It was just in its infancy. So, and at the time, the psychedelic rock was selling a lot of records, and that was the big emphasis. So they stood out, and they were not. This was before Crosby, Stills, and Nash broke ground with their country rock sound and Poco and some of the other ones. So it did stand in big contrast to that. But this album it merits several listens to it. I have to say, I'm not a big fan of the band, but I appreciate what they've done and the mark that they left. I mean, Bob mentioned that the song "The Wait" became part of a mark on late, popular culture. Besides Easy Rider, but "The Wait," the song was used in the movie The Big Chill, which came out in 1984, and they were pretty much ready when they moved up to Woodstock to move in Big Pink. And that was the idea of the manager of Bob Dylan. He said, they couldn't record in New York City. They had achieved enough of a notoriety as when they were the Hawks. And prior to that, they played with Ronnie Hawkins, who was a rockabilly artist that was popular in the early 60s. They toured with him. Anyway, they go up to Woodstock, as Bob mentioned, and they recorded everything on a 4-track analog recording. And then it was actually recorded in parts in New York and Los Angeles. So when they, this is based in part on an interview I heard with Robbie Robertson years later, that when they sat down and they played the songs to Dylan and his manager, they looked at it, they had looks of disbelief. They go, "You guys wrote this? You guys?" So, but they had been writing, Robbie Robertson had been writing songs for a while, and they had absorbed all these influences. They were all big fans of, as Bob mentioned, the Delta sound, that part of it. But for me, I mean, this is not a record you put on to get going. This is one of those things that has to work its way into you. And for me, I I appreciate it much more now. At the time, no, my focus was more on sort of the psychedelic influence groups of the era. I didn't really have much time for them, unfortunately. My first exposure, if it's country rock, would be Buffalo Springfield, but I don't think these guys, you can say they're country rock. They're a little bit of they're sort of a potpourri with their sound. And as far as the other songs, I Shall Be Released, I think Bob touched on that too. One of the Dylan's songs. That is my second favorite, although there is another song on here that was called Chest Fever, which I enjoyed, and then I discovered, I thought, boy, that sounds familiar. Well, it was recorded by Three Dog Night.
Yeah, Three Dog Night. That's how I knew that song way back in the day. Yeah.
And when you hear Chest Fever, it stands apart from these other songs. That's about as close on this LP as you find like a traditional rock song. And so those are my favorites on this album. And other reviewers it's been said earlier that this really, not only was it a strong debut album, it was influential as one of the more influential albums of post 1960s music. And it's the band, they went on to have an extraordinary career. They influenced so many people. So I'm a fan, but not a passionate fan, if that helps in anything. And but definitely respect for Robbie Robertson and all those guys. And yeah, Levon Helm, one of the best singers. That's a drummer in popular music, definitely. So that's my my short take on it. And this debut was a little bit of a clue of things to come.
Yeah, I have an intellectual, after listening to this about probably half a dozen times over last week. I have an intellectual appreciation of this album's place in history, but will I listen to it again after we have this discussion? Probably not. It's it's this to me. I mean, there's a feeling there, and I don't know if this is because of impressions I formed over the decades of the band and this sort of music. Looking back in hindsight, you don't know. You really don't know how to get a pure first impression of it. But with the exception of Chest Fever, which, as Dee said, is as close to a rock song as anything on this album, written by Robbie Robertson. It just reeks of that whole rural flavor. I keep thinking of the jug band that we used to see on the Andy Griffith show back in the day. That's what I always think. That's a mental picture I always get when I listen to this music. And it's just this whole to me, it's just like the celebration of just down home rural life, and it's just that's just not a sort of atmosphere that I aspire to, that I've never aspired to. So I just it didn't really strike a chord with me at all, emotionally. Intellectually, I get it. But there are a few of these songs. I was surprised. There were a couple of these songs that I did hear later. Chest Fever being one. I remember Three Dog Night covering that, and also the song "Lonesome Susie," Blood, Sweat, and Tears did on one of their two big albums. I don't remember which album that was on, but I can only hear David Clayton Thomas singing this song, and I really love the way Blood, Sweat, and Tears did this song. It's a little more polished and a little more bluesy than the version that's here, but essentially the same song. So I knew that. Of course, I know "I Shall Be Released." How many different versions of "I Shall Be Released" have we heard over the years? That's one of those Dylan songs that a gazillion different people have either recorded a cover of it, or you've heard them do it in a live show or something. So I knew a little bit more of the songs on this album than I thought. I mean, "The Weight" is the only one that I always identified as as a song by the band. And I'm surprised here because didn't over the course of the band's career, like their bigger hits that they had were pretty much all of the bigger hits sung by Levon Helm.
Yeah, they were.
It seems like it. The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down. Some of the other ones. It seems to me like all the big hits were Levon Helm sung to, and so I always had I knew that the other band members were also singers, but I was always under the impression that Levon Helm was a primary singer. But on this album, Helm only sings 2 songs. He sings The Wait and he sings We Can Talk. Everything else is sung by either Danko or Manuel, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Dylan, as Bob mentioned, Dylan writes 3 of those tracks on it. There are 11 tracks. Dylan writes 3 of them. A couple of those get co-writing credits by Manuel on one and Danko on another. But other than that, it seems like it's pretty much split on the songwriting between Manuel and Robbie Robertson, right? Yeah, that's what it looks like. Interesting album. If you're into an intellectual history pursuit, that's a good listen. If you're like me and a rocker from way back and like the rock and like the blues and all that stuff, this probably isn't going to appeal to you too much because it is so much different than what was happening at that time. And it definitely got a foothold. As Bob mentioned, later on, we started hearing a lot of country rock, and I don't really consider this country rock either. It's more rural rock. It's like rural folk is how I would describe it. Americana. I think the term Americana, as it relates to a genre of music, is probably straight out of this album. But I don't hear a whole lot of country here, just more rural, down to basics sort of songwriting and a musical bent. But would you say, but because country wasn't such a big part of rock and roll back in the day, back during this time, it was more we were more psychedelic. More pop and just 3-chord rock and roll. When this came along, now I don't want to say that I feel like this was a big influence on people like Coco, Crosby, Stills and Nash, and the other folks in the late 70s and in the 80s that were more identified as country rock artists. But would you say, Bob, that if this wasn't if this wasn't so much an influence on those people, was it more of a door opener? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm really qualified to answer that question because I'm far from a musicologist, because I don't see the country in this album.
Yeah, I don't either.
Now their second album, yeah, it's there definitely on their second album, which is where I was introduced to them.
Which we'll get to in a few weeks, but
right,
yeah.
So being a country boy from Southeast Missouri, I loved that album and I still love it. And so when I finally got around to listening to music from Big Pink, I was really put off by it at first because it was so, to me anyway, so different from that second album. So I don't think that this was a precursor to country rock because I don't feel a country influence.
Right. I don't either. But I guess the point I was trying to make, or the question I was trying to answer, is that not so much a precursor, but as a door opener to say, okay, this kind of helped people understand that that a good rock album doesn't have to be three-chord
okay,
bouncy Bill
now I
Haley, and it doesn't have to be, you know, psychedelic things like that. I don't know when was this, were the Byrds around at this time? I guess.
Oh yeah, see,
Yeah.
yeah, good, Scott, for bringing that up, because the Byrds were more of an influence on the development and evolution of country rock than the band, because once David Crosby left the Byrds and they brought in Clarence White, and they were doing things like Sweetheart of the Rodeo and Chestnut Mare, that was the big step away, which opened the door for Poco, you know, and other Buffalo Springfield,
right.
you know, and the band, yeah, they do they're apart because, you know, they don't have that the steel guitar. I think I don't recall anything on Stage Fright being on steel guitar or anything like that. They don't have that sort of you know, New Riders of the Purple Sage, long drawn out stuff that will put you to sleep. But it is a little jangly, it's a little quirky, and I think if sometimes I think that gets in the way of their songwriting, because that, you know, Robbie Robertson and you know, some of their songs were just you know, they're in their own little pantheon there. But yeah, the band, I don't know if you could say they influenced. I think other artists may have incorporated some things, some ideas that they heard the band get from. But it was interesting, this interview with I caught it on YouTube not long ago, but with Robbie Robertson. It was pretty long, over an hour. I didn't get through all of it, but he said when they first, you know, they had broke off from, they were, you know, with Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks. Then they broke off. It was Levon Helm and the Hawks, because he was Levon Helm and Robbie Robertson had formed the band. Then they brought in Danko. They brought in Garth Hudson and Richard Manuel. And so when Dylan had heard, you know, their the basement tape, so to speak, and their demos from Big Pink, you know, he asked them to be his backing band on the world tour. And Robbie Robertson said almost everywhere they went, they were booed. Canada, United States, Europe, they were booed because he thought most of the audience was still, they were upset with Dylan when he went electric. And he said there were people yelling Judas at him, and you know, they would introduce some of their own, you know, so they were, he said it was not fun in the early days, and they decided to, you know, focus on the studio and all that. But
well, yeah, the reception when the band backed Dylan on those 66 tours, it was so bad that Levon Helm quit after about a month, because he walked away from it because he got tired of being booed on stage. And then I read one article where people, yeah, you mentioned Judas, and people in the crowd were yelling out Judas and stuff. And Dylan supposedly turns, you know, to the guys in the band and said, just play this effing loud, you know, and so they just, you know, wailed into it, you know.
Well,
so.
yeah. So the point, I mean, they weren't being booed because they weren't being booed by rock audiences, right? Right.
They're being booed by
Am I getting
audience.
this right? They weren't being booed by rock audiences, you know, who basically thought this was just, you know, old corny, slow stuff or anything. They were being booed by Dylan's old folky audiences who were upset because they were making Dylan too much of a rock and roll star, right?
Yeah. You know, and my thing with the band is because they are so identified with Dylan. I've always ran hot and cold on Dylan. There are times that I think the guy is just absolutely brilliant, and other times it's like, oh my God, what are you doing now? Yeah. And I'm kind of like that way with the band too. You know, that second album I absolutely loved. Stage Fright I liked. This one I appreciate it a whole lot more now than I did back then. And pretty much after the second album, they really didn't do much of anything that intrigued me. I think they were up here and they just dropped very, very quickly, in my opinion. So there's some stuff that the band has done that I absolutely love, but most of their catalog kind of leaves me cold. And like I say, this one really left me cold the first time I listened to it. And I had to go back and I still, ironically, a lot of people think this is their masterpiece. To me, it's not. I love the second album a whole lot more than this one, probably because it's more straightforward and it fits more into my country upbringing, my country roots. But this is very eclectic. And if you look at the instrumentation that these guys brought in here, Hudson, did organ, saxophone, accordion. Richard Manuel was piano and lap steel. Levon and Richard Manuel also did drums. So Levon Helm wasn't always their drummer, because Levon Helm also did mandolin and guitar and stuff. So they mixed it up quite a bit. And there are just so many elements put in here that it's a little bit of a mishmash. So that's why it took me a while to appreciate it. And I still can't tell you that it's something that I would just pick really quick to listen to, but I do appreciate, what they were trying to do here. So yeah, for what that's worth.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar at all with their catalog. The only thing I know the hits, obviously, because it's hard never to have heard any of the hits of the band, because they got pretty big there as their career went on. But I was a fan of the Last Waltz, which was a Scorsese movie. It is a hell of a concert film, but that's really the extent of my knowledge of the band. So as we go through a few of their albums over the next few months, it'll all be new to me. So except for Stage Fright, I remember listening to Stage Fright a couple times when I was a kid, because I think Dee had it. So, but we'll go through. We'll hit their second album, and we'll probably hit Stage Fright at some point over the next few months. I don't know how far into their catalog we'll go, but we're going to do at least the next couple of them.
Good. The band, they I don't want to say as far as influence, but they obviously owe a lot to Dylan and then Ronnie Hawkins. And I didn't know much about Ronnie Hawkins, but from what I've gathered, he was quite one of the greatest rockabilly artists of his era. Accordingly, he was, they said, quite a showman.
He makes an appearance on the Last Waltz. They do a Ronnie Hawkins song with Ronnie Hawkins and the Last Waltz. Okay, well, we'll get to their self-titled second album sometime over the next 4, 5, 6 weeks. Join us next week, where we're planning on having Marissa here to talk with us about the Doors discography. She's going to give us her impression of the last few weeks that she spent listening to all the Doors albums. And we have some pretty good reviews coming up in the next few weeks with Freeform Friday. This Friday, I'll have a review of the Blue Oyster Cult debut album. And we have some pretty good stuff planned for the next few weeks on our Freeform Friday. So thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you.
And we'll talk to you later. So long.
Later.